Welcome to Z Time. We make apocalypse stories for survivors. Thanks for listening. On with the tale. I left Seattle under a ceiling of low gray clouds that looked like they'd been nailed permanently to the sky. By the time the plane started its descent into Los Angeles, the sunlight coming through the window almost hurt my eyes. It felt like someone had turned the brightness of the world up too high. Seattle had a way of draining the color out of things. 6 months of wet sidewalks, damp jackets, and skies the color of old concrete. Teaching middle school didn't help either. 25 kids asking questions at the same time could make even the sunniest day feel like a storm. So when winter dragged into spring and the rain kept falling, I booked the flight without thinking too hard about it. 1 week. No lesson plans. No grading papers. No gray skies. Just California. When the plane touched down at LAX, people actually clapped. I remember laughing quietly to myself when it happened. I hadn't heard that since I was a kid. The moment I stepped outside the terminal, the air hit me differently. It was warm, but not heavy. There was a breeze moving through the palm trees that lined the road outside the airport. It smelled faintly like salt and jet fuel. Even that smelled better than rain. My Uber driver was a guy named Hector who had the radio playing old West Coast hip-hop at a volume that suggested he'd been listening to it for the last 20 years straight. First time in LA, he asked as we pulled out into traffic. First time anywhere warm in about 8 months, I said. He laughed. Then you picked the right week, man. Weather's perfect. As we drove west, the city unfolded in layers. Low buildings painted in colors Seattle would never dare attempt. Murals stretching across entire walls. Palm trees standing tall like they'd been planted just to prove a point. The sky was so blue it looked fake. By the time we crossed into Venice, the whole place had a different energy. The streets were narrower. People were walking everywhere, surfboards tucked under their arms, bikes rolling past, dogs trotting along beside their owners. And then we turned onto a quiet street where the noise of the city seemed to disappear all at once. Venice canals, Hector said. I leaned forward slightly, looking through the windshield. Water ran through the neighborhood in narrow channels like something out of a European postcard. Little white footbridges arched over the canals. Houses sat right on the edge of the water, each one different from the next. Modern glass boxes next to old bungalows painted turquoise or yellow. Kayaks drifted lazily through the water. It didn't look like Los Angeles. It looked like somewhere you went to escape Los Angeles. "This is you," Hector said, pulling up in front of a small 2-story house with a narrow walkway leading down toward the canal. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and thanked him. The moment the car drove away, the quiet settled in. I stood there for a second, just taking in sunlight reflecting off the water, palm trees swaying slowly overhead. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear faint music drifting from the direction of the beach. I checked the code the Airbnb host had sent me and punched it into the lockbox. Inside was a small brass key. The apartment was on the lower level, facing the canal. Nothing fancy, but exactly what I needed. A small kitchen, a couch, a bedroom that looked like it had been designed by someone who really liked white paint. But the best part was the little sliding glass door at the back. It opened onto a tiny patio that sat just a few feet from the water. 2 chairs, a small table, and the canal stretching away in both directions like a lazy river running through the neighborhood. I dropped my bag by the couch and stood there for a moment, listening. No traffic, no rain tapping against windows. Just the quiet movement of water and the occasional call of a bird somewhere overhead. Yeah, I muttered to myself. This'll do. There was a liquor store 2 blocks away. I found it by following the faint glow of a neon sign that flickered in the afternoon sun. The guy behind the counter didn't look up from his phone when I walked in. I grabbed a bottle of bourbon from the shelf and a bag of ice from the freezer. "Vacation?" he asked when I set them on the counter. "Yeah," I said. He nodded like that explained everything. Back at the apartment, I filled a glass, dropped a couple cubes of ice into it, and stepped out onto the patio. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the ocean, turning the water in the canal a warm gold. A couple paddled by in a kayak, laughing about something I couldn't hear. Someone's dog barked somewhere across the canal. I leaned back in the chair and took a sip. The bourbon burned just enough to remind me it was there. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax. No alarms, no staff meetings, no kids asking if the Civil War could have been avoided if Abraham Lincoln had just talked it out. Just water, sunlight, and a quiet neighborhood in Southern California. Tomorrow I'd go explore. The beach was only a few blocks away. I'd heard about Venice Beach my entire life, the street performers, the bodybuilders at Muscle Beach, the chaos of the boardwalk. From there, it was an easy walk north to Santa Monica. The pier, the rides, the ocean breeze. I'd read about a place on the pier called Pier Burger that supposedly made one of the best burgers in LA. Lunch there. Maybe ride the Ferris wheel. Stay until sunset. A whole day doing absolutely nothing useful. I took another sip of bourbon and watched the light fade slowly across the water. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about the next day's responsibilities. I was just thinking about the sun, the ocean, and the fact that for 1 week, I didn't have to be anywhere except exactly where I was. And at that moment, sitting there beside the canal with the warm air moving gently through the palm trees, it was impossible to imagine that anything in the world could go wrong. I woke up to sunlight. That alone felt strange. Back home in Seattle, mornings usually arrived quietly, hidden behind a blanket of clouds. You could wake up and not even realize the sun had come up yet. The light always felt filtered, dimmed, like someone had turned the world down to half brightness. Not here. Here the sun punched straight through the blinds like it had somewhere to be. For a moment, I lay there listening. No rain, no wind rattling the windows. Just quiet. Then I heard the water outside, moving slowly through the canal. It was the kind of morning that made it hard to justify staying inside. I grabbed a quick shower, threw in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, and stepped out onto the little patio with a cup of coffee. The canal was already awake. A guy jogged past across the footbridge with a golden retriever pacing happily beside him. A woman paddled slowly through the water in a kayak, stopping every now and then to take pictures of the houses. Everything moved at a relaxed pace, like the neighborhood had collectively agreed not to rush anything. I finished my coffee, locked the apartment, and started walking toward the beach. It only took a few minutes before I could hear the ocean. At first, it was just a distant rushing sound, like wind moving through trees. But the closer I got, the louder it became until the steady crash of waves rolled through the streets between houses. And the street opened up, and suddenly there it was. The Pacific Ocean. It stretched out to the horizon like someone had spilled blue paint across the edge of the world. I stopped walking for a second just to take it in. Back home, the water always looked cold and gray. Here it sparkled under the sun, waves breaking in long white lines across the beach. The sand alone looked like it went on forever. I stepped onto the boardwalk and immediately realized Venice Beach was exactly as chaotic as people said it was. Bikes zipped past on the oceanfront path. Rollerbladers glided by with a kind of confidence that made it clear they'd been doing it their whole lives. Street vendors had already set up along the walkway, tables covered with sunglasses, paintings, handmade jewelry, and t-shirts that probably violated at least 5 different copyright laws. Music drifted through the air from a dozen different directions. Reggae from one speaker, classic rock from another. Somewhere farther down the boardwalk, someone was blasting hip-hop loud enough to shake the pavement. It was loud, colorful, and completely unapologetic about it. And I loved it. A guy wearing nothing but gym shorts and a cowboy hat rode past on roller skates, carrying a portable speaker the size of a suitcase. 2 tourists stopped him to ask for a photo. He struck a pose like he'd been waiting for that moment all morning. Yeah, I muttered to myself as I walked. Seattle definitely doesn't have this. A few minutes later, I reached the outdoor gym everyone talks about. Muscle Beach. The place looked like a scene from a fitness documentary. Huge guys lifted ridiculous amounts of weight, while tourists gathered around the fence watching like it was a live show. Cameras clicked constantly. Someone was doing pull-ups with a crowd counting loudly beside him. One guy stood in the middle of the gym, curling dumbbells that looked like they weighed as much as my carry-on luggage. His arms were roughly the size of my legs. I slowed down as I walked past, shaking my head slightly. Different worlds, I said quietly. Back home, the most intense workout most people saw before work was carrying their coffee back to their desk. Here it looked like half the beach population was preparing for a bodybuilding competition before breakfast. Past the gym, the boardwalk widened and the crowd thickened. Artists painted murals right on the side of buildings. Skateboarders carved across a small concrete park while people leaned over the railings watching them land tricks. The buildings themselves were painted in colors so bright they almost looked unreal turquoise, pink, yellow, orange. Murals of palm trees, waves, skulls, and abstract shapes covered entire walls. Everywhere I looked, something was happening. And above it all, the sun hung in a cloudless sky. A cool breeze rolled in from the ocean, cutting the warmth just enough to make the temperature perfect. Not too hot, not too cold, just comfortable. I walked for nearly 40 minutes without really noticing the distance. Eventually, the boardwalk began to shift. The buildings looked a little cleaner, the crowd a little more organized, and ahead of me, stretching out over the water like a wooden arm reaching into the ocean, was the Santa Monica Pier. Even from a distance, you could hear it. The faint mechanical hum of rides running. Music drifting across the water. Kids shouting somewhere above the sound of waves crashing below the wooden pylons. The Ferris wheel rose above everything else, its bright colors turning slowly against the blue sky. It looked like something out of a postcard. I checked the time on my phone. Just afternoon. Perfect. Lunch first. Then I'd wander around the pier for a bit, maybe ride the Ferris wheel, maybe grab a beer somewhere and watch the sunset. I started walking up the ramp toward the entrance. The boards creaked gently under the steady flow of people moving in both directions. Tourists carrying cameras, families pushing strollers, teenagers laughing and running ahead toward the rides. Everyone moving through the afternoon like they had nowhere important to be. For the first time since I'd landed, I felt like I'd truly arrived. No schedules, no responsibilities, just the ocean breeze, the sound of gulls overhead, and the smell of grilled burgers drifting somewhere from deeper inside the pier. I smiled to myself. "Pier burger," I said quietly, because at that exact moment, standing there under the California sun, with the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly behind me, my biggest concern in the world was whether the burger everyone kept talking about was actually as good as people claimed. And I had absolutely no idea that within the next hour, the entire pier would turn into the most dangerous place I had ever seen in my life. The burger was even better than people said it was. I carried the tray outside and sat at one of the small tables facing the ocean, the kind with metal chairs that screech across the concrete when you move them. The air smelled like salt, grease, and sunscreen. On the tray sat a paper-wrapped burger, a pile of crinkle-cut fries, and a tall chocolate milkshake in a clear plastic cup. I unwrapped the burger first. It was simple but perfect. A soft toasted bun, a thick patty, crisp lettuce, tomato slices, pickles, and a generous smear of whatever their homemade sauce was supposed to be. Nothing fancy, just a really good burger. I took the first bite and immediately understood why people talked about it. Juice ran down the side of the patty. The lettuce had that cold crunch that burgers always need but rarely get right. The sauce had a little tang to it, something between mayo and Thousand Island with just enough bite to wake everything up. I leaned back in the chair, chewing slowly, watching waves roll in beyond the edge of the pier. "Yeah," I muttered. "That's legit." The fries were exactly what fries should be, hot, salty, and just crisp enough around the edges. I dipped a few in ketchup while seagulls circled overhead, occasionally diving low enough to make people guard their food. One nearly landed on the table next to me before the guy sitting there shooed it away. "Nice try," he told the bird. I finished the burger faster than I meant to. By the time I realized it, all that was left on the paper was a smear of sauce and a few crumbs. The chocolate shake came last. It was thick enough that the straw barely worked, which in my opinion is the correct consistency for a milkshake. Chocolate, cold, sweet, with a little whipped cream melting into the top. I sat there for another 10 minutes just enjoying it. Below the pier, waves rolled endlessly toward the beach. Kids ran past with stuffed animals they'd won from arcade games. A couple argued gently over a map near the railing. Somewhere behind me, I could hear the mechanical clank of one of the rides starting up. It felt like summer vacation in its purest form. Eventually, I tossed the empty tray in the bin and wandered deeper onto the pier. The rides were clustered near the far end, colorful and noisy, the Ferris wheel towering above everything else. It turned slowly, the bright gondolas rising high above the water before drifting back down again. I'd always liked Ferris wheels. They were slow, calm. You got a good view of everything. No upside-down loops or screaming required. I joined the short line and waited while the ride operator loaded the next group. A couple in front of me debated which side of the gondola had the better view. The ocean side, the woman insisted. No, the city side, the guy argued. You can see the mountains. I smiled a little. When it was my turn, the operator waved me forward, and I stepped into one of the small gondolas. The door shut with a metallic clunk, and the wheel creaked as it started to move. The pier slowly dropped away beneath me. As the gondola climbed higher, the view opened up in every direction. The Pacific stretched endlessly west, sunlight scattering across the surface like broken glass. To the south, the coastline curved past Venice Beach, the boardwalk just barely visible in the distance. And inland, Los Angeles spread out in a hazy grid of streets and buildings. It was one of those moments where everything felt peaceful in a quiet, simple way. Just wind moving gently through the open sides of the gondola. The slow turning of the wheel. People laughing somewhere below. The ride reached the top and paused briefly while new passengers boarded down at the platform. From up there, the whole pier looked small. Tiny figures moving along the boards. Clusters of people around food stands. Kids running between the rides. It looked like a miniature world. Then the wheels started moving again. My gondola began the slow descent back toward the platform. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. At first, it looked like a fight. Down near the middle of the pier, close to one of the food stands, a small crowd had gathered in a loose circle. People were backing away from something in the center. A man stumbled sideways, knocking into a trash can hard enough to send it clattering across the boards. I leaned forward slightly in my seat. Two people tried to grab him like they were trying to calm him down. The man suddenly jerked violently, twisting out of their grip. Even from the height of the Ferris, while I could see the movement was wrong. Too sudden, too aggressive. One of the people helping him fell backward. The crowd scattered. For a second, I thought maybe the guy was drunk. Or high. That happened in tourist areas all the time. But then the man lunged forward again, grabbing someone by the shoulders and dragging them down to the ground. People nearby started shouting. The Ferris wheel kept turning. My gondola drifted lower toward the platform. Down below, more people were moving away from the commotion now, some walking quickly, others stopping to stare. One woman screamed. Not the startled kind of scream people make when something surprises them. The other kind. The kind that cuts through a crowd and makes everyone turn their head at once. I frowned, gripping the edge of the gondola slightly. Something about the way people were moving down there had changed. The relaxed pace of the pier was gone. Now people were backing away from that spot in quick, nervous steps. And the man in the middle of it all was still moving. Fast. Too fast. The gondola continued its slow descent toward the platform, bringing the scene closer into view. At that moment, I still didn't know what I was looking at. But the uneasy feeling forming in the pit of my stomach told me one thing very clearly. Something down there was very, very wrong. The Ferris wheel didn't stop. That was the first strange thing. Even as people began shouting below, the wheel kept turning with the same slow, mechanical rhythm it had a minute earlier. The ride operator either hadn't noticed what was happening yet or didn't think it was serious enough to shut everything down. My gondola creaked lower. The scene near the food stand was clearer now. The man I'd seen stumbling earlier was on the ground with someone else beneath him. At first it looked like he was wrestling them, maybe drunk and out of control. Then the person under him screamed. Not yelled, not shouted. Screamed. It was the kind of sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up instantly. The man jerked his head downward again, and again. For a split second, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I saw the blood. It splashed across the wooden boards in a bright red arc that looked impossibly vivid under the afternoon sun. Someone nearby shouted, "Hey, get him off." Two guys rushed forward, grabbing the attacker by the shoulders and hauling him backward. He fought them like a wild animal. Not angry, not defensive, just violent. One of the guys lost his grip and stumbled away, swearing. The other held on a second longer before the attacker twisted suddenly and slammed his head backward into the man's face. The crack was loud enough that I heard it from the Ferris wheel. The helper collapsed immediately. The attacker spun around again, lunging straight toward the crowd. People scattered. My gondola was almost at the bottom now. "Stop the ride," someone shouted near the platform. The operator turned toward the noise, confused. "What?" Then he saw it. The man who had been attacked on the ground was still lying there. At least I thought he was, until his body started moving. Slowly at first, then suddenly. He jerked upright with a violent snap that looked completely unnatural. The crowd around him froze. For half a second everyone just stared. The man's shirt was soaked in blood. His face looked wrong somehow, pale, slack, eyes unfocused. Then he lunged forward and grabbed the leg of a woman trying to run past him. She shrieked as he dragged her down onto the boards. That's when panic truly began. The entire pier erupted into noise. People screamed. Children cried. Someone knocked over a drink stand as they ran past. Plastic cups and soda spraying across the walkway. Jesus Christ, I muttered. The Ferris wheel finally stopped moving. My gondola hung about 8 feet above the platform. The operator stood frozen, staring toward the chaos. "Open the door," someone shouted from below. The operator snapped out of it and hurried over, pulling the lever that released the latch. The door swung open. I climbed down quickly onto the platform. All around me, people were pushing away from the center of the pier now, trying to get back toward the exit ramp. But the disturbance had spread. Another person collapsed near one of the game booths. At first, it looked like they'd been knocked over in the crowd. Then they started convulsing violently. A woman knelt beside them. "Sir? Sir, can you?" The man grabbed her arm and bit down hard. The scream that followed was so loud it cut through everything else. My stomach dropped. That wasn't normal. None of this was normal. People were backing away now, forming a loose ring around the two struggling figures on the ground. Someone pulled out their phone. Another person yelled, "Call 911." The bitten woman was still screaming. The man on top of her was tearing at her arm like an animal. 2 guys ran forward to pull him off, but the damage was already done. Blood ran down her forearm in thick streams. She tried to stand, made it 2 steps, then collapsed onto the boards. The guy who'd been attacked first, the one I'd seen from the Ferris wheel, was already moving again. He staggered toward the nearest person, arms outstretched. A teenager tried to push him away. The man sank his teeth into the kid's shoulder. I stood there frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. My brain kept searching for a logical explanation. Drugs, some kind of mass hysteria, a violent mental breakdown. But none of those explanations fit what was happening right in front of me. The bitten woman on the ground began shaking violently. Her whole body jerked like electricity was running through her muscles. Someone nearby backed away, whispering, "What the hell?" 30 seconds later, she stopped moving, completely still. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then her eyes snapped open. She lunged upward and grabbed the ankle of the man standing closest to her. He went down hard, hitting the boards with a thud. She bit him immediately. That's when I finally understood. The realization hit me like ice water dumped down my spine. They weren't calming down. They weren't stopping. Every person who got bitten turned. Fast. Minutes. Maybe less. The crowd finally broke completely. People surged toward the exit ramp in a desperate wave of bodies. Others ran deeper onto the pier, trying to get away from the growing cluster of attackers. Somewhere behind me, another scream erupted. Then another. And another. The Ferris wheel creaked slowly overhead, still turning from its last movement. The colorful gondolas swaying gently in the wind like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had changed. And standing there in the middle of the Santa Monica Pier, surrounded by screaming tourists and spreading violence, I realized something with terrifying clarity. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't a riot. Something was spreading through the crowd. Fast. And if I didn't start moving right now, I was going to be caught in the middle of it. The first instinct everyone had was the same. Run. The problem was there were thousands of people on the pier, and suddenly they all wanted to leave at the exact same time. The ramp leading back toward the beach became a bottleneck almost instantly. People slammed into each other as they tried to force their way down it. Strollers tipped sideways. Someone dropped a backpack, and it disappeared under a wave of feet. From where I stood near the rides, I could see the crowd compressing halfway down the ramp like traffic hitting a sudden roadblock. Someone fell, then someone else, and the people behind them kept pushing. The sound of panic spread across the pier like a shockwave. Screaming, shouting, wooden boards thundering under hundreds of running feet. Behind it all was something worse, the low, animal growling coming from the infected as they moved through the crowd. I backed away from the Ferris wheel slowly, trying to keep distance between myself and the chaos. One of the attackers stumbled past a food stand nearby, chasing a pair of teenagers. He slipped and spilled soda and smashed face first into the boards. The crack echoed across the pier. He got back up immediately. His nose was bent sideways. Blood poured down his mouth, but he didn't slow down. It was like pain didn't exist for him anymore. My brain struggled to process that. A man shoved past me holding a small girl against his chest. "Move," he shouted. I stumbled sideways and grabbed the railing overlooking the ocean. Below, waves slammed into the thick wooden pylons that supported the pier. The water churned violently between them. For a split second, a terrible idea crossed my mind. Jump! But the drop was too high, and the water down there wasn't calm. It was smashing into the structure like a washing machine. If I survived the fall, I'd probably break something. And if those things could swim. I forced the thought away. The ramp was impossible now anyway. People were stacked shoulder to shoulder, screaming and pushing, while behind them the infected were closing in. A man staggered toward me from the direction of the arcade. He was clutching his arm, blood soaked through the sleeve of his shirt. "Help," he started. Then his legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, right in front of me. For a moment I just stared. His eyes were wide and terrified. "They bit me," he said. The words sent ice down my spine. Behind him, the pier had become a storm of movement and noise. The man suddenly started shaking. At first it looked like shock. Then his entire body convulsed violently. "Oh God," he gasped. I stepped backward. 30 seconds later his body went completely still. Then his head snapped up. His eyes locked onto mine. They looked empty, hungry. He lunged. I jumped backward just in time, his teeth snapping inches from my leg. Adrenaline finally took over. I turned and ran, not toward the ramp, away from it, deeper along the pier. My shoes pounded against the wooden boards as I sprinted past shuttered kiosks and game stands. Some people were running this direction too, maybe hoping there was another way off the pier. But there wasn't. The pier widened out toward the end where the restaurants and service buildings were clustered together. Ocean on 3 sides. No exits. My chest burned as I slowed near a cluster of permanent buildings. That's when I saw it. To the right was a bright yellow building with an upstairs deck and wide windows. A sign read Maria Sol. The smell of Mexican food still hung faintly in the air, like the restaurant had been serving lunch only minutes ago. But it was empty now. Chairs knocked over. A drink spilled across the boards. Across from it stood another building. Smaller, more official-looking. White walls. A tower rising above it with windows wrapping around the top. The words Harbor Office were printed above the door. It looked solid. Government solid. Behind me, another scream echoed across the pier. I turned just long enough to see 3 infected moving quickly past the game booths, following the trail of fleeing people. My heart kicked into overdrive. I ran straight for the Harbor Guard office. The door wasn't locked. I shoved it open and slipped inside. The sudden quiet felt surreal. Outside, the pier sounded like the end of the world. Inside the small office building, it was dim and still. I slammed the door shut and twisted the deadbolt. Then I leaned against it, breathing hard. For a few seconds, I just stood there listening to my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The room around me looked like a working harbor patrol station. Desks, radios, a wall covered with marine charts, a first aid cabinet mounted near the door, and a staircase leading up into the observation tower. Through the windows, I could still see the pier outside. People were running in every direction, some toward the ramp, some toward the restaurants, some just running blindly. And mixed among them now were dozens of the infected, stumbling, grabbing, biting. Every time someone fell, another one joined them. My stomach tightened. The ramp was still clogged with people trying to escape, and every second the infection was spreading deeper into the crowd. I stepped closer to the window and looked across the boards toward Maria Sol. The restaurant sat eerily quiet. Its bright yellow walls looked completely out of place against the chaos unfolding around it. A moment ago, this place had been full of tourists eating tacos and drinking margaritas. Now the entire pier had turned into a trap, and somehow I had ended up inside the only fortified building at the far end of it. I glanced up at the staircase leading to the tower. Higher ground, better visibility, a place to see what was happening. But as another wave of screaming echoed from outside, one thing became painfully clear. I might have found shelter, but I was also stranded. Because the Santa Monica Pier had just become an island of panic in the middle of the ocean. And I had no idea how long this building would keep me safe. For a few minutes, I just stood there with my back against the door, breathing, listening. Outside, the pier had become a storm of noise, screams, pounding footsteps, would creaking under the weight of people running for their lives. But inside the harbor guard office, everything was still. It felt wrong, like the quiet inside a church while a riot was happening outside the walls. I pushed myself off the door and took a slow look around the room. It was bigger than it had seemed from outside. 2 desks sat against one wall with radios and paperwork scattered across them. A rack of life jackets hung near the door. There were laminated maps of the coastline pinned up beside a whiteboard with tide times written on it. Someone had left a coffee mug sitting half full beside one of the radios. Steam wasn't rising from it anymore. Whoever had been working here had left in a hurry, or had run. The thought made my stomach tighten, because if the people who worked here had fled, then they'd probably run straight into the same nightmare unfolding everywhere else. Another scream cut through the air outside, closer this time. I moved carefully toward one of the windows facing the pier. The ramp leading back to the beach was still packed. People were trying to push their way down it, but the crowd had jammed together so tightly that movement had almost stopped entirely. It looked like a traffic jam made of human bodies, and weaving through that mass were the infected. Slow, uncoordinated, but relentless. I watched one of them grab a man by the shirt and drag him down into the crowd. The screaming that followed lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped. 30 seconds later, another attacker joined the cluster. My hand started shaking again. Jesus, I whispered. The speed of it. That was the worst part. Minutes. Maybe less. Anyone bitten didn't stay human for long. I stepped away from the window. There had to be something useful in this building. Supplies. A phone. Anything. I checked the desks first. One had a stack of paperwork and a logbook filled with handwritten entries about boat activity near the pier. The other had 2 handheld radios sitting in charging docks. I picked one up and pressed the transmit button. Hello. Only static answered. I tried again. This is... someone inside the Santa Monica harbor office. If anyone can hear this, static. Nothing else. Either the radios weren't connected to anything useful, or whatever system they relied on had already collapsed. I set the radio down. Next, I checked the cabinet near the wall. Inside were first aid supplies, bandages, antiseptic wipes, medical gloves, a small trauma kit. See, it made me feel slightly better. If I got hurt, at least I'd have something to patch myself up with. I moved to the door and slid the deadbolt open just enough to peek outside. The noise hit immediately. Screaming. Running footsteps. Somewhere farther down the pier, something heavy crashed to the ground. But right outside the harbor office, things were strangely quiet. The area between the building and Mariasol had mostly cleared. A few abandoned backpacks lay scattered across the boards. A stroller sat tipped on its side near the railing. I shut the door again and locked it. No reason to risk it. My eyes drifted toward the staircase. It led up into the tower that rose above the building. From outside, it had looked like a small observation deck, probably where harbor staff watch boat traffic and the beach. Higher ground, better visibility. If I was going to stay here for any amount of time, I needed to know what was happening beyond the pier. I walked slowly to the stairs. Each step creaked slightly as I climbed. The staircase spiraled upward inside the narrow tower until it opened into a small glass-walled room at the top. The view hit me immediately. From up there I could see almost everything. The entire length of the pier stretched back toward the beach. Beyond that was Santa Monica itself, streets, hotels, palm trees lining the shoreline. And everywhere, chaos. On the beach below the ramp, people were running in every direction across the sand. Cars were stopped along the road near the entrance to the pier. Some drivers had abandoned their vehicles completely. Others were trying to turn around in the middle of traffic. Even from this distance, I could see groups of the infected moving through the crowds. Small clusters at first, then larger ones. The infection was spreading outward from the pier into the city. My chest tightened as the scale of it sank in. This wasn't just a problem on the pier anymore. This was everywhere. A loud crash from below snapped my attention back toward the end of the pier. Near the arcade, a group of maybe 6 infected had cornered a man against a railing. He tried to climb over it. One of them grabbed his leg and pulled it back down. I looked away. There was nothing I could do for him. For a long moment, I just stood there in the observation tower, staring out across the ocean. The Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon, calm and blue like nothing had changed. The wind-up there was stronger, cooler. It carried the smell of salt and fried food, and something else now too. Blood. Behind me, the Ferris wheel still turned slowly in the breeze, its gondolas swaying gently. A few of them still had people trapped inside. I could see them through the glass panels. Some were waving frantically. Some were just sitting there, waiting. I felt a heavy knot settle in my stomach. Because I finally understood something I hadn't wanted to admit yet. I wasn't just hiding here for a few minutes. I was trapped. The ramp was impossible. The beach was chaos. The city beyond looked like it was collapsing in real time, and the infected were multiplying every minute. I rested my hands against the window glass and looked back toward the buildings clustered near the end of the pier. Maria Sol, the arcades, the food stands, all of them full of supplies. Food, water, maybe even tools or weapons. If I was going to survive here, I was going to have to start thinking differently. Not like a tourist, like someone who might be stuck on this pier for days, maybe longer. And the first rule of survival suddenly felt very obvious. Stay quiet, because down below, the infected were still wandering through the wreckage of the afternoon crowd. And if they realized someone was still alive inside the harbor guard office, this little building might turn into a trap. I didn't realize I still had my phone until I sat down. The office behind the concession stand felt small and stale, like the air hadn't moved in years. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the only other sound was the distant creak of one of the rides swaying slightly in the wind. My hands were still shaking. I sat down in the cracked vinyl office chair and leaned forward, elbows on the desk, trying to slow my breathing. My clothes smelled like fryer oil, ketchup, sweat, and something else I didn't want to think about. That's when I felt it pressing into my hip. My phone. I froze for a second, then reached behind and pulled it out of my back pocket. My phone. How did I forget about this? I stared at the black screen for a moment before pressing the side button. The screen lit up. 28% battery. A wall of notifications dropped down immediately. News alerts, emergency warnings, missed calls from unknown numbers, app notifications stacking on top of each other. My stomach tightened. I unlocked it and opened the first news site I saw. The page took a few seconds to load. The signal must have been weak, but it eventually appeared. The headline made my chest feel tight. Breaking, violent attacks reported in multiple U.S. cities. I scrolled. There were photos already. People running in the streets. Police cars blocking intersections. Someone filming a man lying on a sidewalk covered in blood while people screamed in the background. Another headline appeared beneath it. CDC investigating unknown illness causing aggressive behavior illness. That word didn't feel right. I opened another news site. Same thing. Different cities. Los Angeles. Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas. My throat felt dry. This isn't just here. I opened Twitter. The feed exploded onto the screen. Thousands of posts every second. Videos, photos, people yelling into their phones, trying to explain what was happening around them. One video caught my eye. It looked like it had been filmed inside a car. The camera was shaking badly. Someone was whispering, oh my God," while pointing the phone out the windshield. A man stumbled across the street toward them. His shirt was soaked in blood. He slammed into the car. His teeth scraped across the glass as he tried to bite through the window. The person filming screamed and dropped the phone. The video ended. I swallowed hard. Another clip started playing automatically. Security footage inside a convenience store. A guy collapsed near the counter while two employees rushed to help him. 30 seconds later, he lunged up and bit one of them in the neck. The timestamp in the corner of the video barely moved. Seconds, minutes at most. Just like the woman near the Ferris wheel. Just like the guy who attacked the ride operator. My chest felt tight as the realization started forming. They turn fast, not days, not hours, minutes. My phone suddenly made a loud alert sound that nearly made me jump out of the chair. Emergency alert. The message appeared across the screen in big white letters. National emergency warning: avoid contact with infected individuals. Infected persons may display extreme aggression and violent behavior. If bitten or scratched, seek medical attention immediately. Remain indoors. Await further instructions. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I slowly looked up through the office window. The amusement park outside was completely still. The Ferris wheel stood frozen against the sky. Game booths were dark. Food stands sat abandoned with half-finished meals still on tables. But there was movement. Down near the midway, two of them wandered slowly between stalls. Their movements were wrong, slow, jerky like their bodies didn't quite work anymore. One of them let out a low moaning sound that carried across the empty park. I looked back down at my phone. There was one thing I had to try. I opened the keypad and dialed 911. I held the phone to my ear. It rang. Once. Twice. 5 times. 10. I sat there listening to the endless ringing while the office lights hummed above me. Finally, the call dropped. No answer. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. No police. I muttered quietly to myself. I tried again. Same thing. Just ringing. No one picked up. The realization settled into my chest like a block of ice. No help was coming. At least not right now. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the small office. Desk. Cabinets. Cleaning supplies. The door I had barricaded with a chair. Outside, somewhere in the park, one of those things screamed again. Closer this time. I looked down at my phone. 26% battery. Still enough to see what was happening. Still enough to understand just how bad things were getting. I opened the news feed again. More cities were appearing. More videos. More chaos. This wasn't just a few people getting sick. This was everywhere. I leaned back in the chair and whispered into the empty room. How bad is this going to get? Outside the office window, something shuffled across the midway. And I had this sinking feeling that this place, this empty park I thought might keep me safe, wasn't nearly as empty as I wanted it to be. The sun started going down before I realized how much time had passed. 1 minute, I was staring at my phone, scrolling through a flood of panic from the rest of the country. The next, I noticed the light coming through the office window had turned a darker shade of gold. Late afternoon, maybe early evening. Time felt strange now, like it wasn't moving normally anymore. I stood up from the desk and stretched slowly. My legs were stiff from sitting too long, and the adrenaline that had been running through my system earlier was starting to wear off. In its place was something worse. A dull, heavy exhaustion. I walked over to the window again. From the harbor guard office, I could see the wide stretch of the pier between here and the rides. The board were littered with things people had dropped during the stampede earlier. Backpacks, flip-flops, a stroller tipped on its side near the railing. Paper trays from food stands scattered everywhere. The afternoon crowd had vanished, but the pier wasn't empty. A man wandered slowly near the arcade machines, dragging one foot slightly as he walked. Another figure moved between 2 closed food stands farther down. Both of them moved the same way. Slow, unsteady, like their bodies were running on bad wiring. One of them stopped suddenly and tilted its head, almost like it had heard something. I froze where I stood. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it let out a long, hollow groan and staggered forward again. I exhaled slowly. Okay, I whispered. They weren't searching. Not actively. They just wandered. That was something. Still, standing next to the window, suddenly felt like a bad idea. I stepped back and pulled the blinds down halfway. The office dimmed slightly. The quiet in here was starting to get to me. Earlier, the screams and chaos had filled the air so completely it felt like the world was ending. Now the silence was worse somehow. Every little sound stood out. The hum of the lights. The faint creak of the building shifting in the wind. And occasionally, the distant moaning from outside. I checked my phone again. 23% battery. The signal had gotten worse. News sites took longer to load now. Twitter was still updating, but videos were buffering constantly. Still, the headlines told the story. Los Angeles declares state of emergency. National Guard mobilized in multiple states. Hospitals overwhelmed. I rubbed my eyes. One article mentioned Chicago. Another talked about New York shutting down subway lines. There were reports of police abandoning stations in parts of Texas after entire departments were attacked. The pattern was the same everywhere. Sudden violence. Fights. Then minutes later, more attackers. The government alerts kept repeating the same advice. Stay indoors. Avoid the infected. Wait for help. I laughed quietly at that. Indoors. Technically, I was indoors. Just not in the way they probably meant. My stomach growled loudly. That caught my attention immediately. Right? Food. I hadn't eaten since the burger earlier, which suddenly felt like it had happened 3 days ago instead of a few hours. I stood up and walked around the office looking for anything edible. Nothing. Coffee mugs. Paperwork. Cleaning supplies. No food. No water either. Which meant if I was going to stay here overnight, I'd have to get supplies from somewhere else on the pier. The thought made my chest tighten. Going back outside didn't sound appealing. But staying in here without water sounded worse. I moved back toward the window and lifted the blind slightly. The sky had started turning orange near the horizon. Sunset was coming. The infected I could see were still wandering aimlessly between the stalls. Two near the arcade, one near a Chuo stand, another one standing completely still near the railing, staring out at the ocean like it had forgotten why it was there. None of them were close to the harbor office. Yet, I lowered the blinds again, and I was going to make this place even worse. Harder to see them, easier for them to hear me. I looked around the office. Desk, first aid supplies, radio equipment that didn't seem to work. Then my eyes drifted toward the door. Outside, just across the boards, was Maria's Soul, a restaurant, which meant a kitchen, which meant food, water, maybe knives, supplies, everything I was going to need if I wanted to last more than a day in here. My heart started beating faster again. It wasn't far, maybe 30 feet from the office door, but 30 feet suddenly felt like crossing a minefield. I leaned against the desk and rubbed the back of my neck. Okay, John, I muttered to myself. Think like a teacher. Break the problem down, step by step. Step 1, watch the infected. Step 2, wait for an opening. Step 3, move quietly. Get in, grab what I could carry. Get back here. Simple plan. In theory, outside, somewhere down the pier, one of the infected let out a long, echoing groan. The sound drifted through the evening air. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, another realization crept into my mind. I wasn't just trying to survive the outbreak anymore. I was trying to survive the night. The sun was almost gone when I decided to move. I stood by the window for nearly 20 minutes watching the pier, trying to learn their pattern, if they even had one. They didn't move like people. They drifted, slow, wandering steps, stopping occasionally for no reason, then starting again. Sometimes they bumped into things, benches, railings, trash cans, like they didn't quite understand how the world worked anymore. But one thing seemed clear. They reacted to sound. Every time something clattered in the distance, one or two of them would turn toward it. Not quickly, not like hunters, just curious. That was something I could work with. I lifted the blinds again and looked toward Maria's Soul. The restaurant sat just across the wooden boards from the harbor guard office, maybe 30 feet away. Its bright yellow walls were darker now in the fading light, the windows reflecting the orange glow of sunset. The outdoor tables were still scattered where people had left them. A margarita glass sat on one table, half full. Someone had been drinking that not long ago. My stomach growled again. All right, I whispered to myself. Let's do this. I checked the office one more time. Nothing useful for defense except a small metal flashlight I'd found in one of the drawers. I slipped it into my pocket, but hoped I wouldn't need it yet. Light meant attention. Attention meant problems. I walked to the door and rested my hand on the deadbolt. For a second I hesitated. Outside was the world where everything had gone wrong. Inside this office, at least for the moment, I was safe. But safe didn't mean anything if I starved in here. I slowly unlocked the bolt. The metal click sounded absurdly loud. I froze and listened. Outside, the pier was quiet except for the distant moaning drifting through the wind. No footsteps, no sudden movement. I opened the door just enough to peek outside. The boards of the pier were empty between here and the restaurant. Two of the infected still wandered near the arcade about 100 feet away. One of them leaned against a popcorn stand like it had simply gotten tired. Neither of them was looking this direction. Good enough. I stepped outside. The evening air hit me immediately. Cooler now, the ocean breeze stronger as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The door closed quietly behind me. For a moment I just stood there, listening. The pier felt enormous now that the crowds were gone. Every creak of wood, every distant wave hitting the pylons echoed across the empty space. I started walking toward Maria's Soul. Slow, careful, each step placed gently on the boards. The restaurant door stood slightly open. I reached it in what felt like the longest 30 seconds of my life. I slipped inside. The smell hit me first. Lime, grilled meat, warm tortillas. The dining area looked like the middle of lunch had simply frozen in time. Plates sat on tables. Chairs were pushed back halfway. Someone's purse hung off the back of a chair near the window. No movement, no sound. I closed the door quietly behind me. Hello, I whispered. My voice sounded strange in the empty restaurant. No answer. I moved farther inside. The bar area sat to my right, rows of tequila bottles glowing faintly in the dim light coming through the windows. Ahead of me was the kitchen. That's where the supplies would be. I stepped behind the counter and pushed through the swinging kitchen door. The stainless steel counters were covered with half-prepped food. A cutting board still held a pile of chopped onions. A grill sat cold and silent. But the refrigerators were still humming. Electricity. That was good news. I opened the first fridge. Bottled water, soda, containers of salsa, and shredded lettuce. My heart lifted slightly. Thank you, I muttered to no one. I grabbed a plastic grocery bag from beneath the counter and started loading it. Water first, for bottles, then a couple cans of soda, a bag of tortilla chips, granola bars from a shelf near the office window. Anything sealed, anything portable, anything that would last. The bag was getting heavy when I stopped. A new sound had drifted in from outside. A low moaning, closer than before. I froze. The sound came again, right outside the restaurant. My heart started pounding. Had one of them wandered over here? Slowly, very slowly, I moved toward the kitchen door and cracked it open just enough to see into the dining area. The front windows faced the pier, and standing just outside one of them was one of the infected. It stood maybe 10 feet from glass. Its head tilted slightly. Blood covered the front of its shirt. For a second, I thought it was looking straight at me. I held my breath. The thing groaned softly and stumbled forward. Its shoulder bumped against one of the outdoor tables. The table scraped across the boards. The noise echoed across the quiet pier. My stomach dropped, because two more shapes down near the arcade slowly turned their heads in this direction. And suddenly my simple 30-foot supply run didn't feel simple anymore. For a moment, I didn't move, not even breathing. The infected stood just outside the window of Maria's soul, swaying slightly like it was trying to remember how balance worked. Its shoulder had knocked the outdoor table sideways, the metal legs scraping loudly across the wooden boards of the pier. The sound seemed to hang in the air. Down near the arcade, the two other infected I'd been watching earlier had turned toward it, toward the noise, toward the restaurant. My stomach tightened. Great, I whispered under my breath. The one closest to the window let out a low, hollow groan. Its face was smeared with dried blood, eyes unfocused, drifting slowly across the glass like it wasn't really seeing anything at all. But it had heard the noise, and now the others had too. I slowly pushed the kitchen door open another inch and watched. The two near the arcade had started moving. Still slow, still unsteady, but definitely moving this direction. I counted the distance in my head, maybe 100 feet, which meant I had a minute. 2 if I was lucky. My eyes flicked down to the plastic bag in my hand. Water bottles, chips, granola bars. Enough supplies to last a day or two if I rationed carefully. But the harbor office was still 30 feet away across open boards, and there was already one of them between me and the door. Okay, I muttered quietly. Running wasn't an option. Even if they were slow, the noise would bring every one of them on the pier toward me, which meant quiet, slow, invisible. I backed away from the door and moved along the inside wall of the restaurant, keeping low. The infected outside the window shuffled past slowly, dragging one foot slightly as it moved. Its fingers brushed across the glass. I stopped moving completely. It paused there for a second, head tilted strangely. Then it groaned again and continued stumbling past the window. I let out the breath I'd been holding. The two from the arcade were getting closer now, still about 60 feet away. The one outside the window had moved far enough down the boards that the path to the harbor office was almost clear. Almost. I tightened my grip on the bag and moved toward the front door. Each step felt impossibly loud, even though I was barely lifting my feet. The restaurant door stood half open. I reached it and leaned slowly toward the gap. The pier outside glowed dimly in the last light of sunset. The harbor guard office sat right across from me. So close. The infected that had been outside the window had wandered farther down the boards now, drifting aimlessly toward the railing. Good. The other two were maybe 40 feet away, still walking, still slow, but definitely coming. I opened the restaurant door another inch. The hinges gave a soft creak. Every muscle in my body froze. The infected, near the railing, stopped moving. Its head turned slightly. I didn't breathe. The thing stood there for a few seconds, swaying gently. Then it let out another low moan and resumed wandering. I exhaled slowly. That was close. I slipped through the door and stepped onto the pier. The evening air had cooled even more. The sky was turning deep purple over the ocean. I started walking. Not running, just walking quietly toward the harbor office. 20 feet. 15. I could see the door. 10 feet. Behind me, one of the infected let out a long groaning sound. My heart started hammering. 5 feet. I reached the door, grabbed the handle, and slipped inside as fast as I dared. The door closed softly behind me. I twisted the deadbolt and leaned against the wood, breathing hard. Outside, the groaning continued somewhere near the restaurant. But the harbor office was quiet again. Safe. For now. I set the bag on the desk and ran a hand through my hair. Okay, I whispered to myself. Food, water, a place to hide. It wasn't much, but it was enough for tonight. I carried the supplies over to the desk and started lining them up carefully. For bottles of water, 2 sodas, a bag of chips, 3 granola bars. Not a feast, but it meant I wouldn't have to leave the building again until morning. I sat down in the chair and stared out through the blinds. Night had settled fully over the pier now. The rides were dark, the boardwalk empty, except for the slow shapes wandering through the midway. The infected had spread out across the entire pier now. Maybe 10 of them that I could see, maybe more I couldn't. They drifted through the abandoned carnival like ghosts, moaning, searching, waiting. I leaned back in the chair and took a long drink from one of the water bottles. Cold, clean. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt a small piece of control return. I had shelter, I had food, and I had a view of everything happening outside. But as the wind rattled the windows of the harbor office and another distant moan drifted across the dark pier, one thought kept circling through my head. If this many of them had already ended up on the pier, how many were out there in the city? And what would the world look like when the sun came up tomorrow? The stairs to the observation deck were narrow and dusty, the kind of place that probably hadn't been cleaned since the pier was built. Every step creaked louder than I liked. I moved slowly. 1 step. Stop. Listen. Another step. Stop. Listen again. The building had that hollow quiet to it. The kind where every sound felt too loud and every silence felt wrong. I kept expecting to hear dragging feet or that wet, rasping breathing the dead made. But there was nothing, just the wind outside and the distant crash of waves. When I reached the top, the door to the observation deck was already slightly open. That made my stomach tighten. I stood there for a moment, staring at the gap in the door. If something was up there, I had nothing but a piece of driftwood I'd picked up earlier. Hardly a weapon. I nudged the door open with my shoulder. The deck was empty. A wide wooden platform ringed by waist-high railings. A rusted tourist telescope bolted to the floor. A few cheap plastic chairs that had faded from bright white to dull yellow in the sun. Seagull droppings everywhere. The wind hit me immediately, cold and salty off the ocean. For the first time since everything went bad, I could see more than a few rooms ahead of me. I stepped out slowly and closed the door behind me. That's when I noticed the binoculars. They were sitting on a small metal table beside one of the chairs. Cheap ones, black plastic with a cracked strap hanging off the side. Probably left behind by a tourist. I picked them up and wiped the lenses on the bottom of my shirt. All right, I murmured to myself. Let's see what's going on. I started with the beach. The binoculars brought everything into sharp focus. The sand below was mostly empty, scattered with debris the wind had dragged around. A couple of beach umbrellas had blown over. The lifeguard stand had tipped sideways. Then I saw movement. 3 of them. They were wandering slowly along the shoreline, spaced out maybe 20 or 30 meters apart. One of them was missing half an arm. Another had a face that looked wrong, torn open around the mouth. They staggered along the waterline like drunks who'd forgotten where they were going. The tide rolled in around their feet, and they didn't react. I scanned further down the beach. More shapes. 6, maybe 7. No, 9. Some standing still. Some wandering in circles. Not a horde, but enough to make the beach a bad place to be. I lowered the binoculars for a second and took a breath. The wind carried the smell of salt and seaweed. The world looked calm, but it wasn't. Next, I turned the binoculars toward the park. From up here, I could see the whole thing. Open grass, walking paths, clusters of trees, a playground near the middle. The grass looked trampled now, patchy and dark in places. Bodies were scattered across the field. Some of them weren't moving. Some of them were. One of the moving ones was crouched over something on the ground. Even from this distance, I could see its shoulders jerking. Eating. I forced myself to keep looking. Near the playground, for more of them wandered around the swings and slide. One kept bumping into the chain-link fence, pushing against it over and over like it couldn't figure out how it worked. I counted slowly. At least 15 in the park. Probably more in the trees. That knot in my stomach tightened again. If they drifted toward the pier, things could get complicated fast. The street was my last stop. This was the one I really cared about. The road that ran along the beach used to be full of cafes, surf shops, little restaurants. From up here, I could see broken windows everywhere. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the road, doors hanging open. One of them had smashed into a light pole. There had been panic here. Halfway down the street, I spotted a police car sitting sideways across the road. The driver's door was open. No officer anywhere. Then I noticed something lying in the middle of the street. A body. I watched it through the binoculars. For a few seconds, it didn't move. Then it twitched. Slowly, it rolled onto its side. My grip tightened on the binoculars. The thing pushed itself upright, movements stiff and awkward like its joints barely worked anymore. Another one standing up. Damn, I whispered. I kept scanning further down the road. That's when I noticed the smoke. A thin gray line rising above the buildings further inland. Not a huge column like a building fire. Something smaller, steadier, controlled. A cooking fire. I stared at it for a long moment. Someone out there was alive. I lowered the binoculars slowly and rested them on the railing. The wind rattled one of the loose chairs behind me. For the first time since everything started, something other than fear crept into my chest. Hope. But hope wasn't simple anymore. If there were survivors out there, they might help. Or they might take what I had and leave me for the dead. Either way, people meant noise. Movement. Risk. I looked back out at the park. The dead kept wandering slowly through the grass. Sooner or later, some of them would drift this way. My quiet little hiding spot wouldn't stay quiet forever. My eyes drifted back to the thin column of smoke rising in the distance. Someone was out there. And now I had a decision to make. Stay hidden here on the pier, or go find them. I stayed on the observation deck longer than I meant to. The binoculars rested against the railing while I watched the thin column of smoke rising somewhere inland. It drifted slowly in the evening air, fading as the sky darkened toward purple. Someone was out there, alive, maybe more than one person. The thought sat in my head like a stone. Part of me wanted to go find them immediately. Another part of me knew that leaving the pier tonight would be suicide. I glanced down at my phone. 18% battery. Not great. The signal was barely hanging on now, too. Messages and news updates had slowed to a trickle. The last thing I saw before the signal dropped was another emergency alert repeating the same advice. Shelter in place. Avoid contact with infected individuals. I snorted quietly. Little late for that. The wind picked up slightly, rattling the loose plastic chairs on the deck. Out on the ocean, the last orange line of sunlight slipped below the horizon. Night was coming fast. I picked up the binoculars again and scanned the pier itself. The amusement park rides stood dark now, the bright colors barely visible in the fading light. The Ferris wheel loomed like a giant skeleton against the sky. Movement caught my eye near the midway. One of them wandered between the game stalls, dragging 1 foot behind it. Another stood near the railing, staring blankly out at the ocean. I counted 8 on the pier itself, maybe more hiding between the buildings. The one that had bumped the table near Maria Sol earlier was still out there too. I recognized the blood-soaked shirt. It drifted slowly past the restaurant patio, occasionally bumping into chairs. None of them were moving with purpose, just wandering. That was the only reason I was still alive. I lowered the binoculars and rubbed my eyes. The adrenaline had burned itself out hours ago. Now everything felt heavy. My shoulders ached. My legs were starting to cramp from all the running earlier. I needed rest. Carefully, I headed back down the narrow stairs. Each step creaked under my weight. I moved slow, pausing every few steps to listen. Still nothing inside the building. When I reached the bottom floor of the harbor office, the darkness inside surprised me. The lights I'd left on earlier had flickered out. Power must have finally gone. Perfect, I muttered. Only the faint blue glow from outside filtered through the windows now. I grabbed the small flashlight from the desk drawer and clicked it on briefly, just enough to find a chair again. I didn't want lights spilling through the windows. That would only attract attention. I set the supplies from Maria Sol out on the desk again. 1 bottle of water, a handful of tortilla chips, half a granola bar. Dinner. I ate slowly, forcing myself to chew, even though my stomach felt like a tight knot. The water helped more than the food. When I finished, I leaned back in the office chair and listened. Night had changed the pier. The wind was louder now. The waves hitting the pylons below echoed through the wooden structure. And every now and then, one of them moaned. The sound drifted through the darkness, hollow and distant. It made the whole place feel haunted. I stood up and carefully peeked through the blinds. The pier was barely visible under the weak glow of streetlights from the beach, but I could still see shapes moving. One of them shuffled past the harbor office itself, maybe 20 feet away. It bumped into a trash can and knocked it over with a metallic clang. The sound echoed across the empty pier. Two more figures down, near the rides, turned slowly toward it. They began drifting that way. Sound, just like I guessed earlier. I stepped back from a window. The realization settled into my mind like a rule being written in stone. Quiet keeps you alive. I turned off the flashlight and slid down into the chair again. My body finally started to crash. Every muscle ached. Every nerve felt fried. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the building made my eyes open again. Every distant groan made my heart jump. Hours passed like that, just sitting in the dark, waiting. Sometime deep in the night, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I woke with a start to a new sound. Not moaning, not wind, voices, faint, somewhere out on the pier, and very much alive. At first I thought I was dreaming. The voices were faint, just shapes of sound drifting through the wooden walls of the harbor office. Human voices. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. For a moment I didn't move. I just listened. The wind rattled the windows. Waves slapped against the pylons under the pier. Then I heard it again. Over here. A whisper. Real. Very real. I stood carefully, trying not to bump the desk. My legs were stiff from sleeping in the chair. Every joint cracked as I moved toward the window. Slowly, I lifted one of the blinds. The sky outside was pale gray. Early morning. The sun hadn't fully come up yet, but the darkness had softened enough to see shapes clearly. 3 people were moving along the pier. 2 men and a woman. They were walking slowly, keeping low, stopping every few steps to look around. One of the men carried what looked like a baseball bat. The other had a long metal pole. The woman had a backpack and a small pair of binoculars. They weren't wandering. They were searching. My first instinct was to duck away from the window. People meant danger now. That much was obvious. I'd seen enough of the world falling apart to know that survival could make anyone desperate. But they hadn't come here by accident. They were looking for something. Or someone. I looked past them down the pier. The dead were still out there. 2 near the midway. 1 near the railing where the fishing benches were. But the early morning quiet had slowed everything down. The 3 survivors were moving carefully enough that the dead hadn't noticed them yet. They were good at this. That meant they'd survived longer than most. I stayed there with a blind half raised, watching them for nearly a minute, debating. Staying hidden had kept me alive so far. But how long would that last? Food was already running out. Water wouldn't last forever. And eventually the dead, wandering the beach and park, would drift onto the pier. This place wasn't safety. It was just a pause. The voices drifted closer. "Check that building," the woman whispered. "The harbor office. My building." My heart started pounding again. They were coming whether I liked it or not. I stepped away from the window and looked around the office one last time. The empty desk, the chair I'd slept in, the half-eaten food wrappers, my little temporary shelter. Funny how quickly a place could start to feel like home. The door handle outside rattled gently. Someone testing it. The bat scraped softly against the wood. "Locked," one of the men whispered. I took a slow breath. Then I walked to the door. My hand hovered over the lock for a moment. If I opened it, everything changed. No more hiding. No more being alone. But also, maybe no more surviving alone either. Outside, the woman's voice spoke again. "Maybe someone's inside." I turned the lock. The click sounded loud in the quiet room. Then I pulled the door open. All 3 of them froze instantly. The man with the bat raised it halfway before stopping. For a moment, we just stared at each other. For strangers standing on a broken pier at the end of the world. Finally, the woman lowered the binoculars hanging around her neck and gave a tired half-smile. "You alone?" she asked quietly. I looked past them at the empty ocean, the silent rides, the slow shapes of the dead wandering far down the pier. Then back at the 3 living people standing in front of me. For the first time since everything started, I didn't feel completely alone. Not anymore, I said. The wind carried the smell of salt across the water as the sun finally began to rise over the ocean. Behind us, the world was still broken. The cities were silent. The dead still walked. But out there somewhere were fires burning, people surviving, maybe even rebuilding. I stepped out onto the pier with them, and together we started walking inland, toward the smoke. That's it for today's story. We would love to see you again soon. But most importantly, stay safe out there.